Hi everyone. So welcome back. Next week we're starting to talk about democracy. So if you haven't noticed by now, we've kind of started to turn a corner and we're going to move beyond some sort of abstract ideas of the state or some basics about political sociology and start thinking about democracy and how it functions in the United States. So this is the first week that we've come back to the parent textbook. And his first chapter gives us a sort of summary of the history of democracy, a very quick summary. So I wanted to add some more to that. Particularly, I wanted to have us think about Athenian democracy. We often think about Athens as the birthplace of democracy. Certainly, there were democratic societies in other parts of the world at various points in time. Very rare, but they were there. And Athens is the one that we tend to know the most about. So we're going to start with that. We're going to come back to Tocqueville and think about his views on democracy. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper into how political sociologists and political scientists define democracy and some debates about how to improve democracy. And so perhaps the best place to start with that is to really have us sit back and think about a question that we maybe have never thought about before. And that is, why do we want democracy? We take democracy for granted. We assume that it's the best form of government. We don't spend a lot of time defining what it means. And so we often end up thinking about democracy in different ways. We end up sometimes doing things that may be questionably democratic without really understanding why. And paradoxically, we may do things through democratic means that can undermine future democracy in a society. After all, the Athenians had a democracy for nearly 300 years and it collapsed. It collapsed under the sway of sort of populist, blowhard, not quite tyrants, because they gave the people what they wanted, but the things that the people wanted were not necessarily good for them. Similarly, Rome lasted almost 5 centuries as a republic before it descended into empire and then dictatorship and eventually ruin. So we know that democratic systems can collapse. They've happened all over the world. In the 1930s, Germany essentially voted away its democracy by electing Hitler. Numerous other societies have done the same at different points in time. And sometimes even countries that we think of as very firmly democratic can have moments that cause serious doubt. France had a military coup in the 1950s. Some people worry about the fate of democracy in countries even like the United States, with the breakdown of many political institutions. So asking ourselves what democracy is and why we want it actually becomes a really important way of deciding what's worth defending about democracy and what's worth sort of advocating for when it comes to democracy. When you look at the Athenians, one of the things you'll notice is that their idea of what it meant to be a democracy is very, very different from the one we have today. In fact, they would not view our country today to be a democratic one at all, largely because we have elections. We tend to think of democracy as defined principally by elections. The Athenians hated elections. They thought elections were aristocratic. After all, when you vote for someone, aren't you trying to pick the best person? Athenians didn't think there was such a thing. They thought everyone, all citizens at least, were equal. And so therefore any citizen could hold a position of authority. So they pick people by lottery. We do that today in jury trials. So thinking about how that worked is a really interesting question. Tocqueville, if you remember, really admired American democracy. But there were some things about it that troubled him. You've already encountered some of his concerns he had about race or about economic inequality that was beginning to emerge even in the early 1800s in the United States. But he also worried about this idea of a pampering or pandering to the people's every whims and the sort of the decline of intellectual curiosity and the decline of education and the kind of virtues that are required to be citizens. In fact, the kind of virtues that Machiavelli actually speaks about. I know a few of you had some interesting well, Machiavelli is difficult to understand, largely because he's been so vilified in the West. We think of Machiavelli as advocating for tyrants or for cruel leaders, and that's not really what Machiavelli was about at all. Machiavelli was arguing instead that political leaders needed virtue, but a particular kind of virtue. And here he meant excellence, right? Virtue can mean excellence. And it was excellence on behalf of the state, of the public. In other words, a political leader needed to put the state's interests above his own and above the interests of any individual people in his community, above special interests. And when a leader did that, sometimes it meant having to suppress the people, to not give them what they want. Sometimes it meant being cruel and not being merciful to enemies in order to not encourage additional acts of treason or other kinds of problems. And so all of those things meant that a ruler may not always be popular. A ruler may in fact be disliked for some of their decisions, but they should always act in the interest of the state. And Machiavelli thought that this was true not just of princes, but of citizens. That it was the obligation of citizens to act virtuously, in the sense of to put aside their personal religious doctrines, to put aside their personal special or economic interests, to put aside all of those things and think only of the good of the whole, the good of the state. Tocqueville worried that in the kind of democracy he saw emerging in the United States, there was an animosity towards experts, towards people who knew better about the economy, about the environment, about poverty, about a number of different issues. And they didn't trust experts because, after all, everybody was equal and everyone's opinion was the same. And Tocqueville worried that such a system could eventually fall under despotism. There's an old joke about democracy that people used to say, and it's important to realize that democracy has only been considered a good form of government for the last 100 years or so. There's a reason none of the founding fathers called the United States a democracy. They called it a republic. It's because democracy has a terrible connotation for most of its history. Democracy meant rule by the mob. Democracy is a lynch mob. And so the old joke goes like this: democracy is 3 wolves and 1 sheep voting on what's for supper. If you believe that democracy is nothing more than majority rules, then when the 3 wolves vote to eat the 1 sheep, that's a democratic decision. Who should complain? But we don't think of democracy that way anymore. We also think about democracy as involving individual rights that no one, not the state and not the rest of society, can interfere with. Your right to speak, your right to have your own religion, your right to petition the government for grievances, the right to protest, all of those things, right? So wrestling with what it means to be democratic means really wrestling with all these things. Can a democratic society ban people from kneeling before the national anthem? Can a democratic society force people to say the Pledge of Allegiance? Those are serious questions. If you believe that democracy is nothing more than majority rules, then whatever the majority wants, they can impose on minorities, whether they're religious minorities, economic minorities. Remember that the rich are always a minority. But if we believe that democracy is something beyond that it's something about respecting the individual dignity of ourselves and each other, of building a community in which we all coexist together, that's a really important thing to think about. And so Jane Mansbridge and some of the other authors are thinking about how can we make democracy more meaningful for us? How can we make it something that we all have a stake in, that we all want to participate in, that brings actual value to our lives. And this goes back again to Machiavelli. Machiavelli thought that being a citizen was the most noble thing a person could aspire to be. Machiavelli thought that being a citizen and exercising the obligations of citizenship made you a better person, that it actually brought value to your life. That's the kind of virtue or excellence that Machiavelli was thinking about. And he thought about how sometimes we have to actually do, paradoxically, things that don't seem virtuous, don't seem like a good Christian, in order to do that. So to go back to Machiavelli, just one quick example that I wish I had brought out earlier, and that's this. Think about World War II. I think we can all agree that of all the wars or of all the enemies we've ever fought, the Nazis are clearly one that I hope most of us can agree were the real bad guys. And think about in the days before World War II, Hitler rose to power in the 1930s. We knew who he was. There was no real pretension. He laid out in his book that he wrote in prison that he was going to invade Europe, that he was going to kill the Jews. These are all promises that he made. And when someone says they're going to kill you, you should take them at their word. And yet, the presidents, or the leaders, the Prime Minister of Britain, the President of France, a few other leaders, were so desperate to avoid war, so desperate to avoid the bloodshed that would happen if there was a war. They didn't want to do a preemptive strike on Hitler. They didn't want to force Hitler into a war. So Chamberlain, right, and the French government tried to negotiate with him. In fact, Winston Churchill, who today is regarded as one of the heroic political figures of World War II, was up until the beginning of World War II vilified by his own countrymen for being a warmonger, because he continued to advocate for strong military defense and a response to Hitler. And we know, in hindsight, that Chamberlain was wrong. Appeasing Hitler, allowing him to take Czechoslovakia without firing a shot, allowing him to invade, occupied Germany that the French had occupied without firing a shot, led to war. There was nothing that we could do about it, seemingly, although Churchill warned us about it. On the other side of the Atlantic, Franklin Roosevelt promised Americans peace. He said he would not get involved in the war. He lied. He gave money, weapons, and material aid to the British and to those fighting the Nazis for years before we entered the war. He did it because he knew it was in our best interest and in the best interest of securing peace and democracy in the world. Today, we honor FDR and we honor Winston Churchill. But think about the things they did in order to win that war. Winston Churchill ordered the daylight bombing of German cities. In other words, we bombed civilians massively in order to destroy the German war machine. We built a nuclear bomb. We sent countless of millions of Americans and British and other troops into harm's way. The war was the most destructive war in the history of mankind. Those leaders were willing to make those sacrifices. They were willing to be cruel, to execute enemies, to drop the atomic bomb in order to save lives. Those things are inconsistent with the kind of Christian principles we're often taught in Sunday school. Turn the other cheek, forgive your enemies, never strike, and simply endure all suffering. But doing so would have been destruction to the United States, to Great Britain, and to other countries. And so democratic leaders, I think, if we put it in this perspective, have to occasionally, as Machiavelli said, know how to use cruelty. They have to use it sparingly. They have to use it efficiently. But they essentially have to be willing and able to set aside personal morality, because states are something different. So the task that we're thinking about for this week then is, as terrible as states are, organizations that maintain a monopoly of violence, if they are essentially protection rackets, as Charles Tilly argued, what does it mean to make them democratic? And what is the challenge in doing so? Okay? All right, I know this has been a little bit longer than usual, but I wanted to make up for the week that I missed. You guys have been doing great on the discussion boards. I'm really happy with that. I'm trying to respond as often as I can. But if you have individual questions, please don't hesitate to email me. I'm also in my office Tuesday, Thursday, 9:30 to 12:30. I look forward to hearing from you. All right? Thank you.